The next day progressed much like the previous day had, and the day before that, and the day before that. I awoke early, far too early, and flinched away from the cold like a newborn babe. Reiko arrived at 7:30 to deliver my breakfast, prompt as usual. She didn't linger, but she seemed a touch more cheerful than before. She even smiled at me. After eating breakfast, a simple hearty meal with crunchy bean sprouts and brown rice, I contemplated. I thought about Sachiko. I thought about Kenta. I thought about Kenji. I thought about the snow and isolation and my writing and fireworks and all the kinds of letters I had received from fans and how harshly the critics had condemned me. I thought of my past self, who had been shameless enough to write love-struck poems about the pretty, fresh-faced young girls he had kissed without considering what lay ahead. What happened when the fireworks faded? Miso soup, endless cups of tea, and inane conversations about the weather. Sachiko's skin had been so smooth, like the skein of a drum. Now it was withered and ropey. Shallow as it may sound, it was Sachiko's looks that attracted me to her at first. But now we were both getting old. Her good looks were fading. What else had I seen in her all those years ago, other than her pouty lips and her long eyelashes? I didn't know. Even now, I still don't know. But I didn't want to think about Sachiko. Not in the Azami Inn. Oh, man. Oh, man. I much prefer to think about Reiko. It's getting worse. I intended to write about the snow, but I couldn't find the words. Everything sounded too cliché. And not cliché in a pleasant way, like Reiko had suggested, but cliché at its worst, dull and bland and uninteresting. So I scrapped it. Left with the desire to stretch my legs, I rose from my room and set off into the recesses of the Azami Inn. I walked down the corridor, the tatami mats creaking beneath my weight, just as I expected it would. This did not stem from a lack of care, as it was clear Miss Kakeuchi put a great deal of effort into the upkeep of this establishment, even with a skeleton staff. Meals were always on time, and they were delicious, too. My room had been spotlessly tidy when Reiko first ushered me inside, and so were the hallways. The tatami mats must have been dusted and wiped down with white vinegar on a bi-weekly basis. But that couldn't reverse the ravages of time. The inn was draughty and creaky and probably leaky, too. The wooden furnishings were being eaten away by termites, and the building tipped precariously to one side, like a drunken man leaning against a cane. Miss Kakeuchi could scrub and wipe and clean as much as she liked, often enlisting Reiko's help, it seemed. But that would not cure this building of its fundamental ailment. Old age. In a way, it was somewhat sad. It was evident, at a mere glance, so much effort had gone into the inn. At what cost? I doubted it could have been a self-sustaining business. Most likely, it was running at a loss. Okay, so that's a fair point to talk about the inn, but we have to notice that there is a parallel there with Sachiko, because he's talking about how Sachiko is getting old, and thus she's, wearing down because of time as well. So it's kind of like no matter what she does to try and make herself look prettier and cleaner, it's like won't be good enough for him. Then again, I wasn't a businessman. It wasn't my duty to judge. But it did make me feel sorry for Miss Kakeuchi in its own way. Living in a secluded place like this, which was growing more and more secluded day by day, must have been enough to drive anybody mad. I crossed through the hallway and out of the entrance, and soon found myself in the snowy grounds outside the inn. The sun was high in the sky, but it was wan and pale, hidden shyly behind the clouds. Maybe it was afraid of melting the snow. If it was, I would have understood. I feel guilty, too, for disturbing such a sheet of perfect, pure lily white. It was as I pondered this, my very presence crunching and compacting the once perfect snow, even as I stood there, that I heard a voice. It was a light, gentle voice, like the tittering of a robin. I was reminded of the bird I had seen skittering about in the branches of the trees the other day. But, to my addled ears, this voice was even more charming. "Hello, A.G. You're up nice and early again this morning." It was Reiko. Of course it was Reiko. Who else in this cold, dismal place would address me so jovially? She held her trusty shovel in hand, as she had done before, the right sleeve of her kimono rolled up in such a manner that Miss Kakiuchi would surely have scolded her if she had seen. Fortunately, Miss Kakiuchi wasn't here. Reiko looked well for it. "Hello, Reiko," I greeted her with a restrained bow. "Were you shoveling snow again?" Around the hot springs. They're the only reason anybody ever comes here, so we have to make them look nice. It's a bit hard, though, when it's always snowing. Isn't it difficult work for a girl your age? I can manage it. I'm used to it. I'm tough. Reiko gave me a reassuring smile, like a healthy, rosy-cheeked worker from a piece of communist propaganda, and flexed the muscles of her exposed arm. There was no muscle definition to be seen. Her arm seemed rather too delicate to support a roosting butterfly, let alone shovel snow for hours on end. But Reiko, despite the irony of her gesture, hadn't been lying. She was tough. If you live high up in the snowy mountains, perhaps it's inevitable that your outer shell would be stronger than most. If Miss Kakiuchi had been there to witness this display, I fear she would have fainted. Not only was Reiko giving me, a man, an unabashed view of her alabaster arms, but she was doing it on purpose, too. How scandalous. Of course, there was nothing erotic about the gesture. Reiko meant it in jest, obviously. Her eyes crinkled around the edges, and she started to giggle. For all Reiko disliked her life, she was still able to smile, tell jokes, and laugh. The laughter pierced my heart. It hurt. "Say, Eiji," Reiko looked up at me, still smiling her coy little smile. "If you don't believe me, I can prove it." "Prove what?" "That I'm stronger than I look." "Oh," I raised an eyebrow in amusement. "And how are you going to do that?" "We could have a competition." "A competition, I stroked my chin, like a bard pondering their next composition. "That sounds interesting." "It is. Leaning close and I'll tell you about it." You whispered in my ear. "Well," Reiko relented, "you don't need to be that close. Close enough." All right. He obviously wanted her to whisper in his ear. Now my interest really was piqued. I shuffled forwards curiously, surveying this impetuous young maiden with folded arms. "Is this close enough?" "Closer," Reiko said, and I obliged. This performance repeated 3 times over, until I found myself standing a good deal nearer to Reiko than I had ever intended. She was so close, I could have taken her hand in my own if I had wanted to, and linked our fingers together. I could have pressed Reiko's tiny, pale hand between mine, like dried flowers in the pages of a scrapbook. Reiko's body was so small. I wondered what it would feel like to touch her. I wondered if her hands would be like ice. If her hands were like ice and her skin laced with snow, then her eyes were big and intense and burning. So again, we have her being compared to snow. Or I guess that's the first time, but that's what they were intending before. Just like fireworks. Her gaze held mine unapologetically. Okay, so she's like fireworks. So yeah, it's kind of like he's coming back to his old self, because he keeps saying that he changed from the person who wrote fireworks, but now it's like he's coming back to that same mentality that he had when he wrote fireworks. Her gaze held mine unapologetically. She didn't look away, and neither did she hang her head. Her cheeks remained unflushed from embarrassment, colored the lighter shade of rose pink, imaginable from the cool wind. "I think," she said, and leant forward a touch more, captivated by every single syllable that fell from her lips. "Yes, what do you think?" There was a pause, broken by the soft sound of the morning breeze as it stirred her hair, my sleeves, my heart. And then, "We should have a snowball fight." So, what makes me more uncomfortable about this is that they're punctuating that he is feeling very, attraction here. And immediately, when he's feeling that, she says something that is so juvenile, to really emphasize that she's more like a child. And so we did. Reiko put her shovel away, then led me into the forest. She was so enthusiastic about her idea, she seemed half ready to take me by the hand. I wish she had taken it. I was too much of a coward to seize the opportunity for her. Like all opportunities, however, it was brief and fleeting and passed without event. Reiko didn't take my hand, and I didn't take hers. Instead, she ran ahead in front of me, as much as her kimono would allow her to run, and turned, the wind spilling dark hair across her white face, begging me to hurry. I tried to hurry, but I was older than Reiko and didn't want to cause myself undue injury. I explained my trepidation to Reiko, and she laughed and called me an old man. I didn't often consider myself old, and this adjective surprised me, but it was fair. Compared to her, I suppose it was. Yet you're calling your wife old? So is only her old and not you? Sorry. Even as I followed along behind her, kicking a fine mist of snow up beneath my wooden sandals, I knew I was making a mistake. We were happy in the moment, yes, almost deliriously so, like two lovers eloping. Reiko was laughing, and I had never seen her laugh, speaking with ease as I had never heard her speak, smiling brighter than a burning oil lamp. But it was a delicate, tremulous happiness that couldn't last. It was a happiness that could exist only within the moment, built on desperation and fear and future hurt. Even as we played, Reiko compacting the snow in her dainty hands and hurling the projectiles at me with alarming speed, my heart remained troubled. When her mother found out, Reiko would be in a lot of trouble. I would be in trouble too, of course, for distracting one of the maids in such an unseemly manner, playing with her no less. If we'd been engaged in intimate relations, it would have been easy to understand, but this, oh man, he's saying that it'd be better. Okay. This is the kind of thing children did. But Reiko was a child. That was something I kept forgetting. Oh, how easily we can trick ourselves for the sake of simple convenience. Reiko was a child who had been forced to grow up far too quickly. She could be quiet and reserved, the insides of her arms and her skinny wrists carefully hidden away behind layers of cloth, but that wasn't who she truly was. Beneath the perfect image Miss Kakiuchi had attempted to cultivate, Reiko was a buoyant, bright, energetic young thing who loved life and derived joy from simple pleasures. Here she would wither and die. She was withering already. The roses in Reiko's cheeks, in full bloom, as she giggled and ducked and shrieked in the snow, would recede when she returned to the gloomy inn that she called a home. Reiko had been born to laugh and live. She could have done so many things, but she had the misfortune of being born here. What could I do for her? How could I help this funny, cheerful, lively girl whose very soul, her essence, was being drained away day by day? I didn't know, but that spurred me on with yet more energy. I was too old to play in the snow, and my joints were aching. My fingers were trembling, and I was sweating from the exertion despite the cold, and Reiko wasn't going easy on me. She had hit me 4, 5, 6 times, so many times I had lost count. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not when she looked like she was having so much fun. I doubted she got to have fun very much. Fun is important. It's a key aspect of our lives we so often overlook, particularly when we get older. Why should we have fun when we have other more pressing matters to attend to? Family affairs, daily chores, endless work. But Reiko was too young to worry about such things. She shouldn't have to worry. I wanted to wipe all her worries away. Reiko's head was tipped back. She was laughing. At that moment, I wished I was a painter or a photographer, not a writer. Writers can't capture moments as they happen. They can file images away inside their heads and attempt to recreate them on paper. But no matter how perfectly we try, it just isn't enough. Writers are a nostalgic sort by necessity, I think, always hearkening back to the past as we try to relive it, affirm it, adore it. But we can never possess it, not really. When we write, the only things we record are memories, hazy, wavering, uncertain. Writers can never state anything with complete certainty. There's always some margin of error. There are some imperfections that can't be smoothed away, no matter how we try. Perhaps it's true what they say, another cliche, but it conveys its meaning well. A picture can paint 1,000 words. But a picture of Reiko, as she was then, tendrils of hair stuck to her cheeks, her face flushed with happiness, was priceless. I would have cherished such an image until the day I died. And where on earth have you been? Miss Kakeuchi's voice was sharp enough to cut steel. Her eyes were just as searing and almost tempestuous in her wrath. My hostess's hands were held firmly on her hips, creasing the material of her kimono. It was clear she was trying to remain calm and cool, as was befitting of the proprietress of such an establishment, but it was proving difficult. Her chest rose and fell with ill-suppressed passion. It was a passion I hadn't known a woman like Miss Kakeuchi was capable of feeling. But Miss Kakeuchi was made of flesh and blood, just like me, just like her daughter. Reiko must have inherited her heady emotions from somewhere. Could her mother have been that source? But unlike Reiko's, Miss Kakeuchi's emotions simmered beneath the surface like a volcano. They were unpredictable, and all the more terrifying for it. Reiko certainly seemed terrified enough, because the poor girl hung her head, looking down at her feet. Her legs and ankles were flushed, pale pink from the cold, and so were her fingers, slightly swollen from exertion. Her cheeks, however, had already begun to lose some of their healthy glow. It was just as I had predicted. Miss Kakeuchi didn't give Reiko further chance to explain. Instead, she swept forwards, her sleeves fluttering, and took hold of her daughter's wrist so tightly it must have hurt. Reiko whimpered. "You should have been by the hot springs clearing away the snow," said Miss Kakeuchi. Contrary to her obvious anger, her voice had dropped in volume. "Can you imagine how I felt when I went out to check on you, only to discover that you weren't there? Did you not stop to think about me?" Reiko shuffled. "I did clear away the snow, though. I put the shovel back." "I don't care about the shovel," Miss Kakeuchi explained. "I was worried about you. I was searching all over." I didn't think I was gone that long," Reiko replied, her voice hushed. But it was the wrong thing to say. Miss Kakeuchi's expression twisted horribly, until her face no longer looked like a human's. Rather, it looked some rough, crude facsimile made from clay. The eyes and nose and mouth gorged out by clumsy, inexpert hands. For all the negative opinions I had about Miss Kakeuchi, I never once thought she was ugly. She was unsettling, yes, cold and remote, like the location of her inn, but not ugly. She was too fair-faced despite her age, and her short hair framed her features most charmingly. Hers were a simple, understated prettiness, tarnished somewhat by age. But she was not pretty at that moment. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Not gone for that long, Miss Kakuchi repeated, her eyes narrowing into slits. I was searching for half an hour for you. A whole half hour. Well, half an hour is not that long, really. It takes longer to walk down Higashikawa. Half an hour is long enough. When you're a mother, half an hour is ample time to wait for your wayward daughter, worrying she might never come back. Why on earth would you think that? Don't you trust me? It's not a matter of trust. I worry because I love you, and I know how flighty you can be. You've been like this ever since you were a child. But I'm not a child anymore. You are a child, Reiko. You are my child, and I want to keep you close. I want to keep you safe. But half an hour? A lot can happen in half an hour. Don't you remember what happened when you were 12 and you went for a walk in the forest? Miss Kakuchi paused, her shoulders heaving with emotion. It must have been a painful memory, one that I, a relative stranger, should not have been privy to. You said it would only be a short walk and that you would stick to the path, but you broke your promise. You strayed and you got lost, and I was waiting for you for hours and hours. I had to call the police, and they sent out a search party. I was terrified they'd find you buried beneath the snow, half frozen to death. That was a long time ago, Reiko tried to counter, but her voice was trembling. It isn't the same. It was not the same. You're not as old as you'd like to think. But it's different. I came back this time, said Reiko. I came back and I'm here now, and you can see me and talk to me and touch me. So why are you so worked up? Worked up? Miss Kakuchi repeated her daughter's inquiry, her eyebrows raised into two arches. I was making myself sick worrying about you, and this is what you have to say for yourself. You don't even apologize. Mother, No, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear you answering back, Reiko. It's unbecoming and supremely irritating. You're in no position to reason with me. You shouldn't be asking for forgiveness. Forgiveness for what? For being a bad daughter. Reiko's mouth fell open, stunned and shocked by the injustice of it all. But no words came out. Instead, there was a broken sob. The tears didn't well in the corners of her eyes. They remained suspiciously dry. Perhaps it was because she had known. As Reiko and I walked back through the forest, retreading our ugly footprints that scarred the pure white snow, she had fallen silent. She had shuffled a little closer to my side with each and every step, and again I had wondered whether she might take my hand, but she hadn't. Instead, she had seemed content to exist beside me, our shoulders almost brushing as she sighed. I had a lot of fun, Eiji, she had said. That's good. I had a lot of fun too, I had replied. But she said it in the past tense, with a maudlin look on her face. She had a lot of fun. When she returned to the Azami Inn, however, that fun would be far behind her. Fun was something Reiko's childhood had been void of. Her life had stretched out in a long, lonely gulf without any friends. I had been silent up until now, anxious. My interference would make matters worse, but I couldn't remain silent any longer. Reiko isn't a bad daughter, I said. It was a simple statement, but it was enough. Miss Kakuchi didn't let go of Reiko's wrist, but her grip slackened. She turned her head, looking at me with undisguised hatred, as no proprietress should look at her guest. It was the kind of look that would have earned this establishment a very scathing review indeed, had I not known this gesture would be entirely useless and wouldn't give Reiko in the slightest. In fact, it would probably have made things worse. Oh, Miss Kakuchi said, her eyes flashing. Oh, and what do you have to say that? Right do you have to say that, Mr. Tanabe? You have only been here for 3 days. Do you profess to know my daughter better than I do? No, that isn't it, I said, struggling to keep my voice smooth. It isn't Reiko's fault that she was absent. It was mine. What do you mean? I wanted to go for a walk. and I asked Reiko to accompany me. I didn't feel comfortable venturing into the forest by myself. Miss Kakuchi looked up and down. Her eyes narrowed. Is that so? Yes, I said, and I bowed my head deeply. I apologized for any offense I might have caused. But you didn't seem to have any problems going into the forest alone 2 days ago. Ah, yes, I remembered. I had asked Miss Kakuchi if there was anywhere I could go for a walk, and she had responded in turn. Just keep to the signs. If you don't stray from the signs, you'll be fine. I'd set off on my own, lost in my undulating, not entirely important thoughts. Reiko hadn't been with me back then, and neither had I asked for a companion. It was little wonder Miss Kakuchi didn't trust me. Why should she? To her, I was nothing more than an unwanted interloper, forcing myself between her and her daughter. It was crude, really, uncouth. As a stranger, I had no real right to insert myself into this conversation. It would have been much more gentlemanly to skirt around about the two warring factions and retreat to my room, but I couldn't do that. I might have been a stranger, but I had become too involved with Reiko to let her suffer alone. I just wanted to see if there were any interesting sights I thought Reiko might know, given she has lived here all her life. I thought it would be better to have a guide than to search by myself. Sights? What sights? Said Miss Kakuchi. There are none. Yes, well, Reiko told me that, but I was insistent. I'm afraid I caused some problems for her. She was in the middle of shoveling the snow, of course, but... You mean to tell me you took advantage of her? Miss Kakuchi pressed. Her grip on Reiko's wrist grew weaker and weaker. You forced her to accompany you against her will. I didn't mean it like that at the time, I confess. I mean, I am paying you, so... You are paying for food and board, said Miss Kakuchi sharply. Not my daughter. Reiko isn't for sale. Her time is rather more expensive than anything you could hope to give me. Yes, I realize that now. She's lucky to be cared for so deeply. I see now that I can't compete. Of course you can't, said Miss Kakuchi, sniffling. How could anybody compete with the mother's love? Well, quite. Miss Kakuchi sighed as though she had a headache and let go of Reiko's wrist. The young girl whimpered, rubbing at it with her hand. Reiko's head was hanging, so I couldn't clearly see her face, but perhaps that was a good thing. I knew she wouldn't be smiling, not like she had earlier. I feared this confrontation had knocked all the joy out of Reiko, like dust being beaten from a tatami mat. What if she couldn't bring herself to smile around me again? Her mother wouldn't have approved of it, I was sure. Her mother didn't approve of much. I appreciate that you were trying to do your duty as a good host, Reiko, but you don't need to listen to everything the guests say. You have more than enough work to be getting along with. Yes, Mother. And as for you, Mr. Tanabe, said Miss Kakuchi, straightening up, I think you should keep your distance from my Reiko. The possessive Miss Kakuchi used bothered me. She spoke as though she was daring me to lay another finger upon her most prized possession. I wanted to tell her that Reiko was not a possession. She was her own person, and not nearly as helpless or immature as Miss Kakuchi seemed to give her credit for. But I didn't think that would have done any good. Perhaps Miss Kakuchi could not recognize Reiko desired independence, because she had nursed her as a baby. In her eyes, Reiko would always be a little girl. Not just any little girl. Her little girl. And mothers always know best. I apologize, I said again, bowing my head, because there was nothing else I could do. I didn't want to come between you. I can see now what was wrong of me, quite wrong. Indeed it was, said Miss Kakuchi archly. I know Reiko's pretty, but she's far too young. She doesn't have any experience. If she's charmed you, I'm sure it was inadvertent. A sniff. If you're after the attentions of a pretty young girl, you can flirt with the other maids. Talk to Yoshiko or Miyako. But leave my Reiko alone. And there it was again, the possessive. My. I could see it clearly through Miss Kakuchi. was no longer clinging to her daughter's wrist. There was a bond between them far stronger than that tenuous thread from folk legend, the red string of fate. This was no strain. It was forged from iron.